Which Side Podcast is a proud member of the Which Side Media Collective.
This week's episode is brought to us by our Amazon affiliate link.
It's super simple how it works. All you need to do is when you're planning to buy things from Amazon, use our link that we provide in our show notes or over at whichsidepodcast.com. You just click through that link before you buy your stuff. Then you find all the stuff you need, do all your fun checkout stuff, and we get a kickback of those purchases. Super simple. Doesn't cost you anything. In fact, you're kind of fucking over Amazon because you're taking money away from them that you were planning to give them anyways.
Basically, we get a little, they get a little less.
It's straightforward. Works the best, like I said, if you're already planning on buying things from Amazon. But if you're just looking to support the show and you want to buy something through Amazon,
you can get the Recipes for Disaster, an anarchist cookbook by Crime Think.
So check that out. It's in the link in the show notes. And if you haven't yet, you should always check out the Crime Think podcast, The Ex-Worker. This is episode 151.
This week, we bring you another installment of our Which Side lecture series. This clip is provided by past guest and friend of the program, Jeff Worth of Burning Hearts Media. It's called Animal Rights and Anarchism, and it's a panel discussion with Scott Crow and Josh Harper about the relationship animal rights has had with anarchism in the United States, the role of the state in animal exploitation, and how bridges can be built to better organize for the future. Super awesome. Stay tuned. Check it out.
Do you have any news and events this week?
Sea Shepherd still has a wish list looking for donations for their ships, so check that out in the show notes. By clicking that, you're also helping support our podcast as well as Sea Shepherd, so be cool. We don't have any listener shout out this week. If you'd like to do a listener shout out, just go to whichsidepodcast.com, click on the donate tab. All we ask is at least $10. That's how much it costs to produce each episode of our show, so that's how much we ask from you. Not only do you get a listener shout out, but you also get some sweet ass swag sent to your house.
And stay tuned for the Which Side's Collective store opening soon, where you can support this show and all and other shows in the collective with some sweet, sweet, sweet vengeance. And by vengeance, we mean clothing and other zines and bandanas and patches. You know, the cool stuff.
Stickers.
For the Slingshot this week, October 2nd, 2005, 50,000 farmers in India protest against the World Trade Organization.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's a good one. We pulled these little tidbits of history of the Slingshot personal organizer. You should totally support them, and you can do that by getting the personal organizer at a local info shop or an online info shop like AK Press.
I really hope you enjoy this episode.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side? Which side are you on? 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 Which side are you on?
Good crowd. Not sure if everyone in the back can see me over the heads of everyone. Shall we get started then?
Yeah, let's rock this thing.
All right. Hey everyone, I'm Josh, and this is my friend Scott here. I guess this is a panel on anarchy and animal rights. And because we are anarchists, we are, of course, fuck-ups and unprepared for today. So you'll have to forgive us. No, just kidding.
It's just a ruse to foil the state.
Yeah.
We're actually super organized.
Yeah. So I guess to talk about how anarchism relates to animal liberation, for me, Got to hop in the old Josh Harper time machine here, go back a few years. I often tell people that I have been an anarchist since birth, and I say it because I mean it. I can't remember any point in my life where I didn't chafe at authority. And I grew up in a household where there was a pretty strong dichotomy between those who had power and those who did not. On the one hand, there was my father, and I think that a lot of folks remember their father as being sort of a large, imposing figure, but my father really was a huge, imposing figure. He was a football player in college, and then he went to the Vietnam War. He was a soldier, and like so many soldiers who came back, he was just deeply troubled from his time there. He never lost that fitness that he had in the Army, and when he came back, he was an auto mechanic. So he had very big arms, big hands, one of those guys who, the neck connects with the shoulders over here. Just a very big guy, and unfortunately, also quite violent and quite domineering. And then on the other hand, I have a sister named Alita, and Alita was born with autism, and she's just about the sweetest, most wonderful person on earth. One of the very interesting things to me about Alita's disability is that one of the ways that it's manifested in her is that she doesn't quite understand the concept of saying things that are untrue. And so that was always both handy and humiliating when I was a kid. How do I look today? You look like an asshole, that kind of thing. Sweet plaid pants, Josh, that kind of deal. Anyhow, though, I do remember watching the ways that my father acted in the world and sort of the circle of power that he had around himself, the way that he could affect and influence things going on around him through intimidation, through coercion, and so on. And then on the other hand, there's my sister, and she's small, and she's meek, and she's gentle, and she's other. She's not like the rest of us, right? And so constantly I saw the abuse and neglect and mistreatment that she had to deal with in the world, and the misunderstanding that people had of her. And it infuriated me. As time went on, as we all do, I had more and more experiences in the world with authority and the state. One of the first ones I remember was being on the Ocean Beach Pier in San Diego when I was a kid. And it was me and my mom and my sister and my dad out for a walk on the ocean. And my dad had long hair. When he was in Vietnam, he was in a tank that actually caught fire. And so he was covered with burns, and he would wear heavy clothing everywhere he went. And it was the middle of the summer. So these cops first start kind of hassling him about the clothes. What are you trying to hide? Why do you have so many clothes on? You got drugs on you? You got weapons on you? But mostly it was about his appearance, his hair, and the fact that, we were working class. He was an auto mechanic. His clothes were torn. His clothes were covered in grease. And I saw them humiliating this man in front of his family. And I started to understand that the cops, too, had a circle of power and a way that they could affect the world around them through violence and through coercion. And after time, how easy and casual that abuse of power became to them. It got to the point where I think a lot of us became sort of invisible to them. When you begin to think about billionaires, when you begin to think about senators, congresspeople, when you begin to think about presidents and other heads of state, these people also have a circle of power, one much larger than my sister's or my own or anyone here in this audience. They can affect the entire world with their circle of power. In fact, they can end the entire world with their circle of power. As time went on, I began to see the different ways that this power that I'm talking about manifested. And we talk a lot about privilege in radical communities nowadays. And to me, when we're talking about privilege, we're talking about power. I began to see the power that just through the basis of my biology, the way I was born, the skin color that I have, I began to see the way that power manifested. It took me a while, but eventually I became aware of the way that my circle of power affected the animal nations, other species. As a human, as somebody who was born into this species, I can run roughshod over the natural environment. I'm given that privilege by our culture and our society. I have the ability to go to a restaurant and order the dead body of a once living creature, of a once thinking, feeling, breathing being who wanted to be free, but instead was kept behind bars for the entirety of their life. I had the privilege to go and with my money ensure that somebody's feet never got to touch grass, that they never got to smell fresh air or to see the sunlight. And again, I recognize this as a casual abuse of power. It was something that felt so natural and so easy that it was no longer an overt, clear act of oppression. It was, I'll take a Whopper Jr. and a side of fries. That's how casual this abuse of power had become. And so one of the things that I wanted to do as I became involved in animal liberation is I wanted to start to examine these circles of power, and not just amongst individuals, but amongst communities, amongst organizations, amongst states and governments. And I wanted to understand how it affected not just myself, not just the other humans in my community, but the biological community at large. And I guess for me, that's the connection between anarchism and animal liberation. I want to make sure that these concentrations of power, the big ones, the ones that can run roughshod over all of us, the ones that cast a shadow that turn the rest of us invisible, I want to make sure that those are brought down. I want to make sure that all of our circles of power become a little bit more equal and a little bit more fair. And animal liberation is very much a part of that struggle to me. Scott.
Thanks. Man, how can I follow that up? Jeez, maybe I should dance. My name is Scott Crow, and like a lot like Josh, I think that many of us are born anarchists. And think about anarchy as just a political reference for the things that we want to do, that we want to be free beings. But what happens is that civil society and the state push down on us from the beginning and always try to change the way that we are about things. You know, like, I think when I was a kid, when friends of mine would smash frogs or torture cats, I didn't feel good about that. And sometimes I would be coerced into playing along with that. But I knew that it was innately wrong. And I didn't know, but I didn't have a cultural backing for it. I grew up in a small working class town. I grew up next to U.S. Steel, next to a railroad track, literally on the wrong side of the tracks. And although my mom was awesome, my dad was the bastard who called himself my father was not so awesome either. And much like Josh, I have very similar trajectory in that, to fight against authority. And but I didn't understand it. And then the first time I got an understanding of the political language of it was in late high school. And how many of y'all came through anarchism or the ideas of anarchy through punk rock or hardcore? Right, it's a big entry for a lot of people. For me, that's not where it came, because actually what I saw was a lot of hardcore and punk rock kids were assholes. And that the anarchy that they wanted, the anarchy that they talked about was a nihilistic, narcissistic anarchy, and it was awful. It's not like it is today. This is in the 80s when it was like coming up. So it's definitely different. The scenes are much bigger now, and that's a broad stroke. But there's only it was like in town there was like one Liberty Spike person, and it was like one of each. We had each of one of the caricatures, and they were jerks, But I kept knowing it was wrong, but there wasn't. But I grew up in Texas, and anarchy was not anywhere except for outside the punk rock scene. So I fell in with a lot of people with communists, big C communists and big S socialists, because that's who was around, right? And started organizing with them to do things, because they were actually organizing and doing things. And but I kept knowing that I didn't like it, because there was still an authority in there, because it was party line. Like, they were telling us what to do. We were the proles. Now, I didn't have a deep understanding, like all of us. Like, it's a revolutionary journey. Like, I wasn't like born with great consciousness. It's like a bubble that rises to the surface, right? Like, it started expanding as it got to the surface, and I learned more and more and more. But I always felt differently about it. And I want to tell one story that I think that illustrates. Josh, you talk about punching the guy who was abusing his dog. And the story for me is that when I was a kid, my mom was watching PBS, and there was this organization where these people were putting their lives on the line between these whaling ships and these whales, and they were in this little raft, and I'm going to start crying now just thinking about it. Seeing those people do that was amazing to me, and it was so far from the world that I wanted, but I always wanted to be a part of that world. And as I kept going in my life, I was like, who were those people? Now, they weren't anarchists, but I didn't understand it, but they were willing to help another species, and that meant something to me. I knew that helped break open the thoughts that we don't have to torture cats and dogs, and we don't have to smash every frog. We don't have to destroy the living world around us. We don't have to tear down the trees. And but when we got to the late 90s, I'd been a vegan and vegetarian. I started working with PETA in 1988, and came into really being a lot more political consciousness through music. And but through animal liberation work and through radical environmental work, because I'd worked in the system and out of the system all during these decades, and I didn't even stop until 2000, stopped working within the system at all. There was this constant of the way that power was being shared, that we were looking at liberation from not just labor or environment or something, but people were connecting the struggles. And that philosophy was anarchy. You know, Earth First, anybody here participate with Earth First or know about Earth First? Yeah. You know, like, Earth First is like we were doing tree sits. And, you know, for me it was in the late 90s and early 2000s, so 99, 2000, 2001. You know, I got to talk about affinity groups and really learn about that stuff. And all of the militancy in the street, the black blocs that you see now in the United States, came out of animal liberation. All the anti-fur protests and stuff were black blocs. I mean, I remember seeing pictures of who I didn't know was Josh and people like Josh and others that are in this room then. But I was like, oh, it's those people, because they were in the Northwest. I was in Texas, right? But it was awesome seeing what they were doing. Now, black blocs is not everything, right? But it's still it's all these pieces that start to build. So in the late 90s, I come back to anarchy, and when I came back to it, it was reintroduced to me in a whole different way, and it started to make sense because anarchy was common sense. It was all the things that we start to do, that innate thing that we know, not only to oppose authority, but to build collective shared power. And anarchy was the only philosophy, the only political dynamic that talked about animal liberation, earth liberation, and human liberation together. And that is a powerful concept. And what is anarchy, right? It's the idea of mutual aid, that our struggles are connected, right? Solidarity. If you have more power in a situation, you help those who have less power in a situation. Direct action. You do not wait on somebody else to tell you to do something. If you see the problem, you do it yourself. Those are powerful things. Collective liberation is a strong and powerful thing. And anarchy is the only philosophy, the only political, the only cultural set of ideas that we use in political reference at all that actually addresses that. And I think that that's a really powerful thing to me. And it's really helped in organizing. And you know, like, I know that the Shack campaign gets framed a lot around the anti-apartheid movement, which is actually where I cut my teeth in 1985. But to me, Shack actually was the greatest anarchist campaign that had happened in the United States. Because one, it didn't try to appeal to power, the corporations that we went after. It said, we are going to do whatever it takes to stop you. It didn't say, we want a kinder, gentler vivisection. It said, none. We don't even want you to be in business. Also, it was decentralized. And I don't mean that, I'm not telling y'all the story, but this is the way I came to it, you know. It was very decentralized. You could do what you want. Affinity groups formed. You know, we could all be working on the Shack campaign simultaneously and not even know it because it's all decentralized, because nobody was telling us what to do. That's a pretty powerful concept, right? Because that's not traditional organizing that we go around doing all these days. And so, and it's the same in the Earth First movements and the radical environmental movements. What is it that people form? Affinity groups, which come out of anarchist organizing. And what is it that we want to do? We want to share power. We want collective liberation. We want the natural world, which we are a part of. Even though we're living in buildings like this, we are still part of the natural world, even though we just don't understand it all the time. That we want a better world for all of us. The other thing that anarchy talks about a lot is diversity. And I don't mean just like racial or gender diversity, but it talks about diversity, biodiversity. You know, in the anarchist world the anarchist worlds that I would envision and that I would hope that we would all envision would look differently everywhere. That everything is not civil society doesn't look like this city or that city, but it's wild in some places. Or like the analogy I use a lot is that anarchist communities would look like forests. Right? You know how forest looks the same from far away. All forests look the same, right? They have the same elements to them. But forests on the east coast of the United States and forests on the west coast or in the southwest are all different, right? All the flora and the fauna is different within them, even though they're made up of the same things. It's the same way with anarchy, is that we have these basic sets of ideas, these basic practices, these basic ways of collective liberation that we want to live, and that that they look differently everywhere. There's no one, we don't franchise it and make it look the same everywhere, but it looks different because it's living and dynamic. And to me, those are all powerful concepts. And I think, you know, like a lot of the literature that's written about anarchy these days talks about the growth of anarchy in the United States in the last 40 years, which has really been a large trajectory. And most of us are here today because of Seattle, the World Trade Organization, and what happened after Seattle in 1999. Because the post-Seattle movement, anarchy had its coming out party. But what's lost in that story a lot is the importance of the radical environmental movements and the radical animal liberation movements that were rising up with an incredible militancy, and the anti-fascist movements of the 90s in these stories. And I think that we need to change those narratives about that, and that, you know, that in building, if we want animal liberation, if we want earth liberation, that we must connect these struggles to other things. How does it relate to immigration in this country? How does it relate to the police state? How does it relate to prison abolition? Because these are all forms of power and hierarchy and patriarchy that are over all of us, and that we need to stop it all. And so for those of you who just want animal liberation, think about how it connects in the struggles, and then start to connect those struggles. Because that's how we're going to build real power. And I believe that anarchy is a philosophy, a set of philosophies, a set of political ideas and strategies that we can use to do that. So that's it.
All right. This is a little point of interest to me that is probably just going to turn into an obnoxious tangent.
I love that.
It's interesting that you brought up the idea of anarchy being like a forest. One of the things that I'm very interested in has been the history of anarchist participations and movements for wilderness defense and animal liberation. And one thing that happened to me one thing that I found as I began to look through old literature was there are constant references to people doing time, being locked up for their activism. One good example is Alexander Berkman. How many folks here know who Alexander Berkman is? All right. Looks like there's a few who do not. So Alexander Berkman was an anarchist around the turn of the last century. There was a wealthy industrialist at the time that Alexander Berkman was young and beginning to develop his ideas around direct action, militancy, and anarchism. And this wealthy industrialist's name was Alexander Frick.
Charles Frick.
Charles?
I think it was Charles. Oh, maybe. Frick.
We're probably both wrong.
Yeah. Some historian Frick probably knows.
But
I'm a mangler of history.
But anyhow, Frick had brought in Pinkerton thugs to break up a strike, and had been responsible for basically keeping down and impoverishing the employees in his factories. And so one day, Alexander Berkman walked into his office and pulled out a revolver and shot Frick, and unfortunately failed to kill him. He himself was tackled and beaten, and then was shipped off to a terrifying prison where he spent years and years and years in solitary confinement. From the inside, they never crushed that revolutionary spirit of his. one of the things that I most admire about Alexander Berkman was that from inside he actually published a newspaper called Prison Blossoms. And it would be written on whatever little scraps of paper they could get. And it would be sent around to other anarchists who were also imprisoned in this same penitentiary. And they would add little notes or make little corrections, add articles of their own. And then once these scraps of paper were pulled together, they would be written off onto strips of toilet paper and distributed around to the inmates there. At one point, Emma Goldman and some of her comrades actually tried to tunnel Alex Berkman out of the penitentiary. And that was one of many tragedies in Berkman's life. The day that the tunnel was completed and that he was meant to escape, a guard was just walking around and noticed the sod sinking in one area on the yard, and they locked everyone down, and he wasn't able to escape after these folks had spent nearly a year building a tunnel under the prison from a nearby house. Anyhow, he went through this long, terrible ordeal, and then he gets out, and the first thing that he wanted to do when the prison gates opened, he said, was run to wilderness. He wanted to lose himself in the forest. And then George Orwell, at the end of 1984, well, not quite at the end, actually, but when his main character is first released, he wants to take himself out to the forest. And then Emma Goldman, after she first had her citizenship revoked and was sent to Russia, she said that when she got off of the ship, she wanted to run away from every human she had ever seen and embrace a tree. And so there's kind of this running theme almost of nature being the opposite of incarceration. And to me, incarceration is sort of the end logic of the state, of control and of power. Anyhow, today as we talk about anarchism and animal liberation, I think one of the most powerful things that we can discuss is how anarchy can help us to organize and to pave the path to a world where animal liberation is a reality. As Scott said, the Shack campaign had elements of anarchism to it. And it's not to say that every member of Shack was an anarchist. I know that, for example, Kevin Jonas here in the United States most definitely doesn't identify as an anarchist, I think to some degree he would have welcomed a top-down hierarchy in the organization. He didn't get that, though, and that's because those of us who are anarchists did not give him that power. It's not to say that Kevin didn't have power, that he wasn't a powerful person, or that he still wasn't able to be an effective activist. But I am proud that there were those of us who were in the campaign who said, oh, wait a minute, you don't tell me what to do. I give myself the orders. I determine what's going to be done. And there's a certain sense of responsibility that comes with that. I never once felt like during the campaign against Huntington Life Sciences that it was anybody else's duty to shut down Huntington. I didn't know where other people were at in their lives. I didn't know what they were capable of or not capable of, what abilities they had, what resources they had. But I did know what resources I had, and I knew what resources my immediate community had. And I was able to go to other people and to suggest things and hear their suggestions, to sit down and speak with people, to share my anger, and to feel theirs in return as they talked about what they felt about HLS. Sometimes we couldn't find common ground. Sometimes we weren't able to organize together, but that, again, didn't mean that we weren't able to organize. If things had been a top-down hierarchy and I had disagreed with Kevin, what would have happened? I wouldn't have been able to contribute. I would have been away from the campaign. But because we each had the ability to form our own groups in our own areas and to act within our own means and to utilize the strategies and tactics that felt most natural and effective to us, it meant that the campaign was able to spread across the United States and very rapidly. One thing about top-down hierarchies is that they can work quite slowly. You can end up with a situation where you have to wait for the shot to be called. Somebody has to be in place to say, this goes here and this goes here. With the Shack campaign, it was more about, are you affected by this footage? Are you outraged by what you see happening in this lab? Yes, do something about it. And that meant that immediately, instead of having to have somebody come from another city or another state and organize in your town, it meant that you could go back to your town and you could organize. And you didn't have to wait for somebody else. It meant that you were able to print your own literature. It meant that you were able to make your own posters. It meant that you were able to organize your own demonstrations. And you could do all of it without waiting for orders from someone else. This made us more efficient, it made us more powerful, and it made us harder to stop. In the early days of the Shack campaign, the FBI here in the US really thought that it was 3 people at the top. They thought that they could go and harass Kevin and Lauren and Jake. They thought that by raiding their homes or, preemptively arresting them and in advance of protests and all of that, they thought that it would cut the head off and that it would stop the movement of the organization. But instead, what they found was that the beast wasn't a bear. It was a hive of wasps, They swatted the hive, and then, boom, there was this explosion across the country. And in fact, it often meant that when there was repression, instead of them having to just worry about a localized response, instead of just having to worry about people in New Jersey where the Shack campaign had its headquarters office or whatever, it meant that kids would get pissed off in Dallas and El Paso, San Antonio, Oklahoma City, Kansas City, St. Louis, and all of a sudden you would see actions happening in these places. The final thing, though, about anarchism...
Kids and grandmas.
Kids and grandmas. The final thing, though, about anarchism that I think really amplifies our abilities as animal liberation activists is that it demands that we seek methodologies to create change that don't rely on begging. I never one time during the Shack campaign went to some billionaire or some politician or some cop and said, can you please shut this place down? I knew better. I knew that these were people who had a tremendous incentive to make sure that the system as it is continues. They have a financial incentive. They make money. They pay their bills. They have mansions, private jets, helicopters, yachts. They have all of these things off of the back of the animals. So are these billionaires going to stop because we asked them to do it? No. And anarchism gave me the ability to analyze their power, to see it, and to understand how they had gotten to that position of power, how they had amassed this wealth, how they had amassed their ability to basically have the FBI act as their private security. So instead of begging, instead of petitioning, instead of asking somebody else to create change, I tried to go out and I tried to create change. I was able to take it into my own hands. I was able to, when possible, directly intervene. And I guess that's today what I most want to encourage people to do. Too often, animals become an abstraction to us. We don't think about them as real living beings with a consciousness of their own. We might see them in horrific abuse footage. We see them on the fronts of our leaflets. We see them in our videos. We see them in movies like Earthlings. But these are just images. I want to encourage everybody here today to at least one time in their life walk onto a farm and open a cage and hold an animal against your chest and know that the only thing separating them from a happy, pleasant life and a certain miserable, horrible death is you. That is one of the most powerful realizations that I ever made as an animal liberationist. And with enough of that type of direct intervention, the system as it stands would not be able to continue. Thank you.
And to build on that too, I think anarchy also brings the analysis that civilization is the problem. It's tied to patriarchy. It's also tied to capitalism, of course, and that the things that we are living in the cities that we live in, like I'm not a doomsday person. I definitely don't subscribe to deep green resistance that we should all run around with our head and pull our hair out and say the sky is falling. But it takes a lot of resources, and resources being the natural world to maintain the lifestyles that we maintain. And that's not just here. It's in so many places. And anarchy opens up a space for us to not only resist that, but also to create the other. And that's one of the challenges I would also put forth to you. If you want animal liberation, then it is tied to other liberation. So how do we reimagine? How do we rethink civil society? How can we change the world? Because I don't want an all vegan world. I don't want. I love tofutti cuties, but if they didn't exist, I would be just as happy on this planet, right? And so I think making sure that we don't confuse those things, and anarchy opens up this possibility for us to exercise our own power and to start to go that we don't just have to resist power, that we create our own, that we make the state, we make corporations irrelevant, right? And one of the ways that that's happening is like worker co-ops. We need to create more worker co-ops. If we don't like corporations, let's quit trying to reform them because they cannot be reformed. Just like the police system cannot be reformed. The prison system cannot be reformed. Capitalism cannot be reformed. We must create alternatives. And anarchy opens a space for us to do that. So that, and we talk a lot in animal liberation movements about what happens in the city, factory farms, the commodification of animals. But the sister said yesterday, Karen Coulter said yesterday that we need to think about the natural world, the world that's around us, and think biocentrically about everything. Because even though most of us live in cities constantly, there's a whole other world that's being destroyed to maintain this lifestyle, to make those tofutti cuties, to bring food to that all the fake meat products that we have. There's the natural world is being destroyed. Animals are being killed, and the natural world is being destroyed to bring those to us. So we need to think differently about it. And again, anarchy opens up a space for us to do that. And so I talk about anarchy a lot in the way that it's a philosophy, it's a political practice of hope, because it does open that. It's not just resistance. All the other political movements that we have been part of resistance, and we must create, and we must resist, but we also must create. It's dual power. And so in animal liberation specifically, in thinking outside of animal liberation, thinking outside of the urban setting that it is, and factory farms in general, we need to think about the natural world, but also in creating, how do we create this world? And I hope that if you don't take anything from me today, that's one of the things that you will take, is that the politics of possibility, and that every action that we take has dual power. It resists on one hand and it creates on the other. And then with that, it starts to connect the struggles, and struggles is the resistance, but it also starts to create, and we connect the creation. So we do create worlds that look differently than we have today. And the thing is, this is the beautiful thing about it, is that there's a lot of creativity in this room. There's a lot of imagination in this room. There's a lot of heart in this room. All of us, the thing that we talked about being born anarchists, I call it our emergency heart. It's this beautiful, wonderful thing that we're born with, right? That we have. It pumps. It makes us be passionate. It makes us become passionate for things. And it's the thing that drives us. But what it also does, it makes us resist the authority. But also what I would say is keep your emergency heart alive, but create strategy for long-term liberation in that. All right? So after that, let's open up for questions and comments. How about that? Yeah, does that sound good? Y'all want to do that? Tired of hearing us jack our jaws? I am. Questions, comments, concerns, jokes?
I'm sure you have a few jokes.
In the back.
I'm going to be a little brave here and admit that the whole idea of anarchy is scary to me, particularly because of just from my background, the ties to violence. And I'm trying to understand how how to be an animal liberationist when we're trying to prevent violence, is what we're trying to do, is prevent violence against animals, but yet violence against people seems to be heavily incorporated in this.
Into anarchy?
Yeah. At least that's what I've seen. That's what's been...
Can you give an example of that?
Well, just in my life, that's because this is new to me.
Uh-huh.
That's what, media has always projected.
Oh, I see. All right. Well,
I can't, we're people in this modern world. We can't escape the media.
I really appreciate you asking this question, because one thing that I find often at conferences is that we do sort of get into the echo chamber a little bit, and we start all repeating what everyone else is saying, and people don't necessarily get critical. So, yeah. So there is a long-running association in the media between anarchism and violence. Classical anarchist thinkers always rejected that, and they said that anarchy is not the presence of disorder, that it's essentially the ultimate order. And to give some idea of what they meant by that, we're all here today, and we're being respectful to each other. I've seen no one in the audience stab anyone else.
Or they did it quietly.
If they did, that's a miraculous skill. I'm just saying, any of you stabbies today. But anyhow, my point is that we've managed to do this out of a basis of mutual respect, and also the fact that most of us are just not sociopaths. There's no there are cops present in this room, let's be honest, but they're not overtly cops right now, right? They're hiding it. And so, again, without badges and without guns present, we are managing to act in an organized manner and to respect each other and not to commit violence against each other. Personally, right now, my belief is that all of us are managing to act in this manner without threat of punishment. I sincerely doubt that there's anyone here right now who's like, I would love to run up there and hit Josh Harper with a baseball bat, but if I did, I might do time. The thing is that in society at large, most of us do manage to find ways to operate without harming each other. And when we do, say, one of us suddenly does sort of freak out, we lose our temper, we do something antisocial and harm someone else, the thing is that as an individual, without government power, our circle of power is only so large. There's only so much that we can affect as individuals before someone is able to stop us. So if I were today to act in an antisocial manner, and I were to do something violent, the type of violence that you're talking about, I imagine that the people in this room would be able to prevent it. What if I had a badge? How much bigger would my circle of power be?
Giant.
How much harder would it be for people to stop me if I were to come in and do something antisocial? Like, say, arrest somebody for speech activity. That doesn't happen in America, right? I know otherwise. People talk about their fear of anarchism as being violent and necessitating violence in order to create some sort of role, while also ignoring the violence of the state and the fact that the state only has power because of violence. Mm-hmm. The police carry guns. The FBI carry guns. Every judge in the United States is able to enforce laws with the threat of violence and ultimately nuclear force. People ignore the everyday violence of the state. They ignore the fact that every single day in the United States, the police shoot unarmed, innocent people, mostly people of color. Somehow that gets overlooked. People ignore the fact that the United States is able to exert its will in the world through the threat of violence and through the threat of armed force. And that this is something that we do constantly.
We call it normal.
We call it normal. There was a pipeline that the U.S. government and some of their oil drilling bosses wanted to make several years ago overseas. And the people of the country where this pipeline was going to be built repeatedly rejected it, said this is not something we want. That country was Afghanistan. And look what happened there. Again, we get our will as a country through the use of force. What anarchism is asking people to do is to remove those giant circles of power, the ones that are able to basically force people overseas into conditions where they're picking bananas to pay off their national debt, where they're selling sugar and other cash crops like coffee to us because they fear our military, and they fear, of course, also our financial might.
The carrot and the stick.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, what we're asking for is to bring things down to a level where it's manageable and where society can prevent this violence before it grows so large that it becomes uncontrollable. I know I talk an awful lot about the prison industrial complex in this country, and I talk a lot about it because it's affected me deeply. It has forever changed who I am. This also is an act of violence. I think a lot of people think about the Shack case and they say, well, you guys were anarchists and you were destroying property. It's true. I mean, there are things that were broken. There are things that were spray painted. Some rich guy had his boat sung. But you know what? I never took someone away from their home and their family and kidnapped them and threw them behind bars and subjected them to humiliating pat-down searches and strip searches. I never denied somebody the diet that they required. I never medically neglected anyone. I never put somebody into a 9-foot by 6-foot cell for 96 days.
Or for 30 years.
Or for 30 years. Again, the state is violence. Yeah. And to me, while violence would occur in an anarchist society, that violence would be of much less severity than what we're seeing now. And to me, would give all of us a greater opportunity to prevent and end violence.
And I want to build on that because I agree completely with what you're saying, is that there's two other things. Anarchy is just a political reference for what we engage in our regular life, right? If we never used the word anarchy, I wouldn't care. It's not a religion. It's a living, dynamic set of ideas. And I think that we need to remember that. It's not a rigid ideology. And for those that are in it, start kicking on those people. The second thing is that media, like Bonnie, you were talking about media. Media has always portrayed anarchy with violence and chaos, because they have over 100-year history of doing that now. Because it fits into the narrative of the state, because the state's violence is not ever addressed. It is normal, and that anything that happens outside of that. The other thing is that they often say, these mass horrible shootings that have happened lately, in the last 10 or 15 years have really grown. They always, at some point, label those people anarchists. Not anarchists in a political sense. They say anarchy as in chaos, and it's a misnomer. And so if people engage in anarchist behaviors or anarchist philosophy, if you never want to use that term because you're afraid, it's okay. I was there. There was a time when I was like, I used the word radical for a long time because I felt it was safer. Is that weird to think? But the thing is, if we don't believe the corporate media about so many things, why is it all of a sudden that we believe it about this? Because it reinforces confirmation bias. Because we've heard it all our lives. We also heard that capitalism was good all our lives, and we see it on TV every day, right? But does that mean it's good? No, it doesn't make it any better. I think that we must use the same set of critical thinking all the way across the spectrum, and I think anarchy fits in that as far as that goes, in addition to everything that you have said, too. Any other questions? Yes?
Because animal liberation doesn't seem viable within capitalism, but then the situation is so immediate for the animals, how do we... prioritize our organizing? Should we focus it on anti-capitalist organizing and implement animal liberation, or how does that?
Man.
You ready? Yes. Whatever you think is what you should do.
I'm going to have to agree, and the reason I'm going to have to agree is because I don't know.
It's not.
The thing is that if I had the answer, I would be doing it, you know?
We also would be selling a book on that right now.
I would be selling the shit out of that book. Man, I'm going to get called a hypocrite for that money motion later on.
That's not on
There's going to be some complaints about that.
Make the little dollar sign flash right there.
But here's the thing, you know, I know that folks come to these conferences and that they're really hopeful that somebody is going to be able to lay out some sort of framework or blueprint for them that's going to tell them how to get to from point A to point B. There was a time when
there are conferences you can go where they'll do that.
Yeah.
Sadly. Don't buy it.
Bob Avakian.
Yeah.
But anyhow, the thing is that there was a time only a few short years ago where I actually had that kind of arrogance. I thought that I had the solutions. I thought that I had the answers. And, you know, I was happy to tell everyone exactly what it was that they needed to be doing. That sort of ended in a dead end, though. The fact of the matter is when we started SHAC and when we started Sea Defense Alliance and Liberation Collective and Coalition to Free the Langer Monkeys and all of the other campaigns that I have been a part of, we didn't really know what we were doing. You know, we were taking stabs in the dark and hoping that something positive would happen. Things developed sort of organically, and as time went on and we began to look at the urgency of other situations around us, we tried to follow our hearts and to do what was best. And Scott's right. At the end of the day, that's really all that you can do. If there were some magical solution, if there were some science of revolution where you add 2 parts of this and 4 parts of that and the result is revolution, the world would not be in the mess that it is. You know, so instead of us waiting for this magic to happen, that's never going to come, we all need to start striking out in the dark and to see what works and to begin to develop our networks organically, find who we can work with, and attack the things that seem most critical to us. As far as capitalism goes and animal liberation within a capitalist framework, I think you're right. I think that the financial incentive to harm animals is always going to be much greater and much stronger under a system where people can reap those types of rewards, where they can amass so much wealth and so much power to themselves. That said, capitalism is a fact. It's a reality. It's here. It's right now. And one of the things that I find anarchists especially do is they refuse to act as if we're in the situation that we're in.
What?
They want to act as if we've already reached the goals that we're talking about. We haven't. And that means that here and now, on occasion, and this is going to piss some people off, it's going to mean that we have to compromise a little bit. And it's going to have to mean that from time to time, you know, instead of being the vegan who's like, goddamn vegan consumerism every time something new hits the market, you know, we're going to have to be like, well, I'm kind of glad people can get soy ice cream at Fred Meyer now. That's cool. There are that's a compromise I'm willing to make. Soy ice cream. And that's a line in the sand. Soy ice cream I will not do away with. Anyhow, though. Again,
the other thing is that I think that we need to think about, because it's a really good question. There's framework, like we need to reframe the way we think about political involvement. I've talked a lot today about dual power. We don't think about that a lot. We always talk about the resistance, the opposition, the challenging of power, you know, and all of these things. But we never talk about building our power or how much damn power we all have, you know? And it's really important that we recognize that we have a lot of power. Now, that doesn't mean that that capitalism is going to fall tomorrow or that we're going to overthrow capitalism tomorrow. But with building that power, we can do things. It just takes time. Revolution is not overnight. And actually, if a revolution happens overnight, you can always be sure that when you wake up the next day, it's going to be bad for some people, and human and non-human. But actually, stages of revolutions happen continually. And one of the things that's hard to think about now, I've been on the planet a minute now, it's where we are today. We weren't there in the 80s. We weren't there when people were talking about animal liberation in the 30s, you know? And what y'all have grown up in, or are growing up in, some of y'all, took decades to get here. And even though it's still only a kinder, gentler capitalism, right? It did take decades to get, and it will take decades to unwind these things further. So the good things, right? How far? I mean, the fact that we can even have animal liberation conferences regularly, that's a big thing, right? The fact that people are talking about it, that circuses are more shameful now than they used to be. They used to be everywhere, right? Things like that, you take it for granted, but there was a time when people had to fight for it, just like people had to fight for a right for women to vote. You know, like there's things that come in stages, and I definitely don't want reform, but that's the reality of some things, right? It fits in spurts.
Yes. Some hierarchy, not feeling like you're high up on the pyramid, looking down on others, as it means we're going to have to start being a little more social, a little more open to meeting each other, and to stop fucking acting like rock stars just because somebody booked you to speak at a conference. So I will be around, Scott will be around. Please come up and meet us. We'd all love
We're having a rock show later.
It's true. It's going to be awesome. I've got leather pants.
And puppets.
Not real leather. Not real leather.
Right. Thank y'all so much.
This week, you heard
Live On, Live Long by Capone-N-Noreaga.
Right Now you're listening to
Recognize by the LOX. If you haven't yet, please go rate and review us on iTunes. It helps us out tremendously. Thank you to everyone who has done it. And if you have done it and want to continue to do it and help us out, do it again on someone else's device. And do a little hashtag ghost review.
If you do leave a review, we'll be sure to shout you out at the end of the show. If you haven't yet, also like us on social media. Follow us, friend us, obey us, become one of us.
We have all of it just to have fun, interact with you guys.
Totally. We post things on there every day that we don't talk about on the show. Different news and events from animal rights things that are happening right now, anarchist things that are happening right now, just social justice in general. When we see it, we post it.
Yeah, so come be part of the conversation. WhitchSidePodcast.com. Click on the social tab.
Fuck, shit, damn.
You said it.
Which Side Podcast is hosted and produced by Jordan Halliday and Jeremy Parkin of the Which Side Media Collective, with web design by Jordan Halliday and sound design by Jeremy Parkin. Booking by Mari Halliday. Theme music by Commandantes. Go to whichsidecollective.org to check out the other shows in the collective. As always, fuck shit damn.